ordered a wife by mail and described everything with brutal honesty. Yet 5 women fled in terror the moment they laid eyes on where he lived. Can you imagine the humiliation of watching bride after bride reject you, not for who you are, but for what your home looks like? But this story happened in the rural heart of Georgia in 1912 on a property where the neglect hid not poverty, but a pain so deep it had transformed a home into a living ruin. If you are watching this video right now, leave a comment telling us where you are joining us from. Write down your city and state. Let's see how many different places in the US and the world this story will reach. And if you like true stories of overcoming odds and finding true love, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any emotional stories. The dust suspended in the air at the Mercy Creek Railway Depot shimmered under the March sun of that year. Helen Foster clutched the handle of her worn leather valise with both hands, her knuckles white from the grip, as she watched the other passengers slowly disperse. She was 31 years old and wore a simple grey cotton dress, the high collar buttoned tight to her neck, long sleeves defying the heat, a modest hat-covered brown hair pulled back in a severe low bun. Reading glasses suspended on a discreet chain rose and fell slightly against her chest with every controlled breath. Around her, families reunited with warm embraces. Businessmen adjusted their hats and hurried off. A young bride, no more than 19, ran toward a groom who waited for her with a bouquet of wildflowers. Helen observed the scene with a neutral expression, but something tightened in her chest. She was not that radiant young girl. There would be no flowers. There would be no running into open arms. She had come to marry a man she had never seen in person, whose only communication had been 3 formal letters exchanged over 2 months. The last letter was tucked into the inner pocket of her bag. Helen had read it so many times she knew it by heart. Martin Travers, 34 years old, agrarian engineer, landowner, widower for 4 years. He described himself as a serious man, hard-working, with few vices and plenty of land. He offered an honorable marriage, a home, security. He did not promise love, but he promised respect. And to Helen, at that moment in her life, respect seemed infinitely more than she could expect from anywhere else. She had been a primary school teacher in the town of Jasper for 7 years. She loved teaching. She loved watching the children learn their first letters, their eyes lighting up when they finally deciphered a whole word. She earned little, but it was enough for the small rented room at Mrs. Clementine's boarding house, for the books she occasionally bought, for the modest but dignified life she had built alone since the aunt and uncle who raised her had passed away. Everything crumbled because of a misunderstanding and the wounded vanity of a powerful woman. Jasper was a small town where reputations were built over years and destroyed in days. The school principal, Julian Pierce, a 50-year-old man married to Ophelia Pierce, had developed a certain admiration for Helen. Nothing improper, merely the regard of a superior for a competent employee. He praised her work in meetings, asked her opinion on pedagogical methods, recommended books. Ophelia interpreted it differently. A jealous and influential woman, the mayor's daughter, she began to spread poison. First came discreet comments at the local society tea circles. Then more direct insinuations. Helen, a single woman at 30, without family, living alone, must be eyeing another woman's husband. She must be using indecorous methods to gain the principal's favors. Helen tried to defend herself, but the words of a poor teacher carried no weight against the words of the municipal education system's first lady. In July of 1911, she was dismissed under a vague allegation of being unsuited to the school environment. Without references, without a letter of recommendation, without an official explanation she could contest. She sought employment on farms as a governess. Families were interested until they asked for references from her last position. Then faces would close, excuses would appear, doors would lock. She tried seamstress work, but lacked the skill to compete. She tried working in family homes, but her formal education caused suspicion in the mistresses, who feared an overly literate woman might be a bad influence. Her savings began to dwindle. The boarding house needed to be paid. Food needed to be bought. Helen found herself slowly sliding toward that social invisibility reserved for women without family, resources, or reputation. The convent was an option, some suggested. But Helen, though a God-fearing woman, felt no religious vocation. She could not imagine herself locked behind walls forever. It was Mrs. Clementine, the landlady, who suggested it with almost embarrassed delicacy. "There are men out in the country looking for wives by correspondence," she said one afternoon, while they drank tea in the kitchen. "Widowers, mostly, good men who need companionship and help around the house. It's no shame, my dear. Marriage is marriage, no matter how it starts." Helen spent 2 weeks considering it. The idea repulsed her initially. Marrying a stranger seemed like extreme desperation, the final frontier before begging or worse. But as the days passed and no options appeared, the idea became less absurd and more practical. Marriage of convenience had always existed after all. At least among wealthy families, arranged matches were the norm. Why should it be different for her? Mrs. Clementine had contact with a discreet agency that handled introductions. Helen wrote a simple letter introducing herself. 30 years old, healthy, literate, a trained teacher, no vices, no family, no dowry. Honest even in her lack of assets. She received 3 replies. She chose Martin Travers because it was the only one that didn't promise the moon and stars. The only one that sounded genuinely honest. In his first letter, Martin described himself without flourish. Widower for 4 years, no children, owner of 120 acres of good land for cotton and corn. Own home, stable financial situation, simple life. Looking for a wife for companionship and management of the household. He did not expect overwhelming passion, nor did he pretend he would offer it, but he promised dignified treatment, fidelity, and material provision. Helen replied with equal frankness. She told him about the dismissal, the rumors, the difficult situation. She did not want to deceive him. If he changed his mind after knowing, she preferred it be before she traveled there. Martin replied 2 weeks later, saying that rumors did not scare him, that he knew well how small towns destroyed people without cause, and that his proposal stood. They exchanged 2 more letters, settling details. Civil and religious marriage upon her arrival. She would stay at a boarding house in town until the wedding if she preferred, to have time to know him better, but Martin warned that the local inn was precarious. Helen, with little money remaining, said that if he was a man of his word, as he seemed to be, a quick marriage did not bother her. She had nothing left to lose, and there she was, at the station, waiting for a man she only knew through words written in a firm, slightly slanted handwriting. A movement near the exit gate caught her attention. A tall man, broad-shouldered, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face, walked toward the station. He wore simple but clean clothes, brown canvas trousers, a white cotton shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms burned by the sun and muscles defined by labor, worn but polished boots. He stopped at the station entrance, and his eyes scanned the last remaining passengers. Helen took a step forward, instinctively. Was that him? The man saw her and seemed to hesitate as well. Then he walked slowly in her direction, taking off his hat as he approached. "Miss Helen Foster?" he asked, his voice gravelly but not threatening. Helen confirmed, feeling her heart accelerate. He extended a hand in a formal greeting. "Martin Travers, it is a pleasure to finally meet you." His hand was large, calloused, warm. The grip was firm but not crushing. He released her quickly, with evident respect for social boundaries. Up close, Helen could see him better. Angular face, tanned skin, deep-set brown eyes that seemed to carry an invisible weight. Lines around his eyes suggested he was once a man who smiled, but now his expression was serious, almost melancholic. A short, well-kept beard, dark brown hair cut simply. He had the look of a man who worked hard, slept little, and carried worries he did not share. "Was the journey agreeable?" he asked with formal politeness. "It was peaceful, yes," Helen replied. "Thank you for coming to fetch me." Martin made a discreet gesture indicating the exit. "I have the buggy waiting outside. The farm is an hour from here. If you prefer, ma'am, we can go to the courthouse tomorrow morning and the church afterwards. I've arranged a room at the inn for you to rest today." Helen hesitated for only a second. Her voice came out steady when she replied that if he didn't mind, she preferred to go directly to the farm. She had already decided to trust this choice, and prolonging it would change nothing. Martin seemed surprised, but nodded in agreement. "As you prefer, ma'am. Let us go then." The buggy was simple but well-maintained, pulled by a sleek chestnut horse. Martin stowed her bag in the back and offered his hand to help her up. Helen accepted and settled onto the bench, adjusting her skirt. He climbed up the other side, took the reins, and the horse began to walk. The first few minutes passed in awkward silence. Helen observed the landscape, the town buildings giving way to open fields, green hills in the distance, an intense blue sky dotted with white clouds. The heat was dry. Dust rose from the dirt road under the buggy's wheels. Martin finally broke the silence. "I need to warn you of something before we arrive." His voice sounded hesitant, almost ashamed. "The house is not in good condition. I didn't lie in the letter about the financial situation. The farm is doing well, but the house itself is very neglected. I couldn't—" He paused, searching for words. "I couldn't look after it properly after I was left alone." Helen looked at him. Martin's profile showed a tense jaw, his gaze fixed ahead. "Not in good condition in what way?" she asked cautiously. Martin took a deep breath. "It needs many repairs, roof leaks, peeling walls. The yard is taken over by weeds. It is not a pretty place, Miss Helen. I would understand if you wanted to turn back when you see it. It has happened before." There was something painful in the way he said that. "It has happened before." Helen felt curiosity but didn't ask. Her voice was gentle when she replied, "Mr. Travers, I am not looking for a palace. I'm looking for a fresh start. If there is a roof and walls, it is already more than many people have." Martin glanced at her sideways, as if assessing whether she was serious. He seemed to find no lie in her expression and turned his eyes back to the road. "You are very different from the others," he said softly, almost to himself. The road became narrower, bordered by denser vegetation. They passed a wooden gate with a carved sign, St. Helen's Farm. A coincidental name that made Helen smile discreetly. Martin noticed and explained it was a name chosen by his mother, deceased many years ago, in honor of the family's patron saint. 500 yards further, after a curve between leafy trees, the house appeared. Helen felt the visual impact like a punch to the stomach. Martin hadn't exaggerated. If anything, he had downplayed it. The structure was large, a single-story, sprawling old farmhouse with a porch out front supported by wooden columns. But where there should have been beauty, there was desolation. The roof of red cedar shingles showed visible gaps, some broken, others missing completely. The clapboard siding, which once must have been white, was peeling, stained with dampness, with patches of dark mold. The porch had loose boards, windows with fogged or cracked glass. The front garden was a thicket, tall grass swallowing what once were flower beds. More impactful than the physical decay was the atmosphere. The house transmitted a sadness almost palpable, as if it were mourning for itself. It seemed like a building that had given up on being a home. Martin stopped the buggy and didn't get down immediately. He sat there, looking at the house with an expression Helen couldn't decipher. Shame, perhaps, or pain, or both. "I know it's shocking," he said, his voice hoarse. "The others ran as soon as they saw it. One didn't even get off the buggy. Another went in, looked around, and asked me to take her back that very instant. I don't blame any of them. I myself am ashamed to live here like this." Helen continued looking at the house. Something in her, some intuition she couldn't name, whispered that this wasn't slovenliness. A man who keeps a clean buggy, a well-cared-for horse, simple but aligned clothes, doesn't let a house crumble out of laziness. There was another reason. A reason that had to do with the lines of sadness around his eyes, with the weight in his voice, with the 4 years of widowhood he had mentioned. She stepped down from the buggy alone before he could help her. She walked slowly toward the porch, hearing behind her the sound of Martin getting down too. The wood creaked under her shoes as she climbed the 3 steps. Up close, the damage was even more evident. Spiderwebs between the columns, accumulated dust, dry leaves piled in the corners, but the structure was solid, the foundation was strong, the proportions of the house were harmonious. It was a well-built construction that had been beautiful once and could be again. Martin arrived at her side, carrying the bag. His voice was heavy with resignation when he spoke. "If you want me to take you back to town now, I will. You can stay at the inn until you get a train ticket. I won't hold a grudge." Helen turned to face him. His eyes avoided hers, fixed on the porch floor. She realized he was expecting rejection, like one expects an inevitable storm. "How many times?" she asked softly. "How many women came before me?" Martin finally looked at her. 5, over 2 years, all fled. "And you continued trying." He gave something close to a bitter smile. "I'm stubborn and lonely. Dangerous combination." Helen extended her hand. "May I see the inside?" Martin blinked, clearly not expecting that. He hesitated, then handed her a large iron key. "The lock is stiff," he warned. Helen turned the key in the lock with effort. The door opened with a long groan of unoiled hinges. The smell that came out was of a place closed for a long time, mold mixed with stale dust. She entered. The interior confirmed and at the same time contradicted the exterior. The main parlor was spacious, with high ceilings, quality wooden furniture, though covered with dusty sheets, wide plank floors, stained but still handsome. Large windows that would let in abundant light if they were cleaned, but everything was frozen in time. A wall clock marking 3:15, hands motionless, dried flowers in a vase, reduced to grey dust, a thick layer of dust on every surface. Cobwebs in the corners of the high ceiling. Martin entered behind her, standing near the door like a visitor in his own home. Helen walked slowly through the room, running her fingers over the back of a chair, raising a cloud of dust. She sneezed and apologized. "They are beautiful pieces of furniture," she commented. "They were my mother's," Martin replied, "and before her, my grandmother's. The family always took good care of things, until me." Indeed, there was clear self-recrimination in his voice. Helen turned. "Mr. Travers, may I ask a direct question?" He nodded yes. "You had a wife living here, didn't you?" Martin's face closed off. "I did, 4 years ago. And when she passed away, you stopped caring for the house." "It wasn't exactly like that," Martin started, then stopped. He sighed heavily. "It was exactly like that. I can't—" He searched for words and didn't find them. He gestured vaguely around. "I can't move anything. It seems wrong. It feels like betrayal." Helen understood. The abandonment wasn't negligence. It was a sanctuary of grief. The house was frozen on the day of the tragedy like an insect preserved in amber. Martin hadn't destroyed anything, but neither had he allowed anything to change or live. She made a decision in that moment. She walked to where he stood, stopped in front of him, and spoke with gentle firmness. "Mr. Travers, I am going to stay. I will marry you tomorrow if you still want, and slowly, with patience, we will bring this house back to life. But I need you to understand one thing." She paused until he looked her in the eye. "I cannot live in a shrine. I can live in a house that needs work. I can live in a simple place, but I cannot live on an altar to another woman." Martin stared at her for a long moment. Something passed through his eyes, a complex emotion Helen couldn't name. Fear, perhaps, or hope, or both fighting. When he spoke, his voice was choked. "I don't know if I can change. I tried. I couldn't do it alone." "Then perhaps," Helen suggested softly, "you need help, and I am offering it." "Why?" asked Martin with genuine confusion. "Why would you stay in a place like this, with a man like this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Helen considered the question. "Because," she answered slowly, "I am also a person who is starting from zero. Because I look at this house and I see work, not impossibility. Because you were the only person in a long time who treated me with honesty and respect. And because—" She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I think that sometimes God places lost people in each other's path, not by chance, but for a purpose." Martin remained silent. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll show you the rest of the house. There is a room prepared for you. It isn't much, but it is clean." He guided her down the hallway. The house had 8 rooms in total: parlor, kitchen, 4 bedrooms, pantry, and a bathroom. Martin explained that he used only 2 rooms, the kitchen and a small room in the back where he slept. The rest remained closed. The room he prepared for Helen was on the opposite side from his. It was a medium space, with an iron bed, a dresser, a chair, a window with a faded curtain. He had made a visible effort. The floor was swept, the bed had clean sheets though yellowed by time. A vase with fresh wildflowers stood on the dresser, a shy attempt to make the environment welcoming. Helen felt unexpected tenderness for that gesture. "It looks lovely, thank you," she said sincerely. Martin looked awkward at the compliment. He stammered something about letting her rest and left quickly. Helen was finally alone. She sat on the bed, which groaned under her weight. The window looked out to the back of the property, where she saw an abandoned orchard, an empty chicken coop, and beyond, cultivated fields stretching to a line of woods on the horizon. A stark contrast: the work area well maintained, the living area completely abandoned. She took off her glasses, wiped them with the hem of her skirt, and put them back on. "Very well," she whispered to herself. "This is your new life. Make it count." The sun was setting when Helen left the room, after changing her clothes and trying to freshen up with water from the basin. She found Martin in the kitchen, the only division of the house that seemed inhabited. The wood stove was lit, a simple table, cupboards open showing organized provisions. He was preparing something in a pot. He turned when he heard her enter. "I don't know how to cook very well," he warned with embarrassment. "But I can make beans, biscuits, eggs. There is bread I bought in town yesterday." "I can help," offered Helen. Martin hesitated, then nodded. He passed her a knife and a cutting board with onions. They worked side by side in comfortable silence. Helen noticed he moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had done this alone for a long time. Large, calloused hands manipulated utensils with surprising care. The meal was simple but filling. They ate at the kitchen table, lit by an oil lamp. They talked little, short sentences about practical matters. Martin explained the farm routine. He woke before dawn, supervised the workers in the fields, returned for lunch, went back to the fields until nightfall. "How many men work here?" asked Helen. 6 permanent, plus day laborers during harvest. They are good men. They work hard. "Do they live near here?" "In the tenant shacks, 2 miles from here. They come in the morning and go back at night. Formerly there were houses for sharecroppers right here on the farm, but they are abandoned. Why? Martin lowered his eyes to his plate. Because when Camilla passed away, I sent everyone away. I didn't want anyone nearby. I hired them back only after a year, but living off-site. Camilla was your wife? She was. The silence that followed was heavy. Helen didn't press. They finished eating. She offered to wash the dishes, and Martin didn't argue, looking exhausted. He said he was going to check the horse and then retire. He wished her good night and left. Helen washed the pots and plates, put everything away where she had observed him take it from. Then she walked through the house in the semi-darkness, carrying the lamp. Stained walls, spectral furniture, hallways whispering stories of a life that once was. She passed a closed door that Martin hadn't opened during the tour. It sat between the parlour and the bedroom hallway. Helen tried the knob. Locked. Curiosity burned, but she didn't force it. Everything in due time. She returned to her room, lay on the bed, and stared at the ceiling full of shadows dancing from the lamp's flame. She fell asleep, imagining what it would be like to bring that house back to life, not knowing yet that the biggest challenge wouldn't be the house itself, but the heart of the man who had let it die. The next morning, she woke with sunlight streaming through the thin curtain. She got up, performed a simple toilette, dressed, and went out. The house was silent. In the kitchen she found hot coffee in a thermos and a note written in firm handwriting. Went to supervise the fields, back at noon. There is bread and butter. We asked the Justice of the Peace to come here at 2 o'clock. MT. Helen drank her coffee alone, then decided to explore. She went out the back door and walked through the yard. The day was bright and hot, cicadas singing loudly. The abandoned orchard had orange, lemon, and peach trees, but untended. Weeds grew between the trees. Fruit rotted on the ground. It was a crime to let it go to waste like that. The empty chicken coop had a good structure. The wire fence needed repair, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The vegetable garden that certainly existed once was unrecognizable under a layer of weeds. A wash tank, cracked, accumulating stagnant water and mosquitoes. But in the distance, in the direction Martin had gone, Helen saw organized fields, cotton plants aligned in contours, green corn swaying, a brutal contrast between impeccable external work and domestic life in ruins. She went back to the house and decided to start. She couldn't renovate the structure alone, but she could clean. She tied a kerchief around her head, rolled up her sleeves, and started with the kitchen. When Martin returned at noon, sweaty and covered in dirt, he found Helen with a broom in hand, an improvised apron, her face smudged with dust. She had swept the entire kitchen and parlour, taken the sheets off the furniture and hung them on the line to air out, cleaned the parlour windows, letting light enter for the first time in years. He stopped in the doorway, clearly shocked. "What are you doing?" he asked with a strange voice. "Cleaning my future home," Helen replied naturally. "Or have you changed your mind about the wedding?" "No, I haven't, but you don't need to." "Yes, I do. I cannot live in filth. Can you help me move that heavy rug from the parlour later?" Martin stood looking at her with an expression Helen couldn't decipher. Then he nodded slowly. "I can." They worked together for an hour, hauling out the large rolled rug, which they took outside to beat. Clouds of dust rose with every blow. When they finished, they were both coughing, but the rug showed a beautiful floral pattern that had been hidden under years of dirt. The Justice of the Peace arrived at 2 sharp, bringing a preacher along. Elderly, serious men who knew Martin and treated him with a mixture of respect and pity. They performed a quick civil ceremony in the parlour, now clean and illuminated. Martin and Helen signed documents. The preacher gave an equally brief blessing, asked if they had rings. They didn't, and so, without a party, without flowers, without witnesses beyond the 2 officials, Helen Foster became Helen Travers. The whole ceremony lasted less than 30 minutes. When the men left, Helen and Martin stood in the parlor, married and strangers. He scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Well," he said, not knowing what to say. "Well," repeated Helen, "I need to get back to the crops. There's a problem with the irrigation I need to fix." "Go. I'll continue here." Martin hesitated. "Shouldn't you be resting? After all, it is your wedding day." Helen smiled wearily. "Wedding day for folks like us, Martin, is like any other day. Only now we have papers saying we're in this together." He looked at her with something that could be relief or admiration. Helen couldn't tell. Then he nodded and left. Helen continued working until nightfall. She cleaned 2 bedrooms besides hers, swept the hallway, washed windows. At the end of the day, her body ached, but the satisfaction was real. The house was beginning to breathe again. Martin returned as it was getting dark, finding Helen in the kitchen preparing dinner. She had found potatoes and smoked sausage in the pantry and was making a hash. He washed his hands, sat down, and they ate again in almost comfortable silence. After dinner, she gathered the courage to ask something she had thought about all day. "Mr. Travers, may I ask a question?" "You may, and you can stop calling me Mr. Martin is enough." "All right, Martin, that locked door between the parlor and the hallway, what is in there?" His face closed immediately. "It is a room. It is closed because I do not enter there." "Why?" "Because no," he said with a tone that ended the subject. Helen decided not to insist. She nodded and changed the subject. But the curiosity remained, pulsing quietly like an ember under ash. The following days followed a similar pattern. Martin left early, returned for a quick lunch, spent the afternoon in the fields, returned at night. Helen cleaned, organized, transformed the house piece by piece. She discovered she liked manual labor, the sensation of seeing a tangible result from effort. Martin observed the changes with an expression that alternated between relief and fear. It was as if he wanted the house to improve, but feared what that meant. Allowing the house to live again would be admitting that Camilla was gone and wouldn't return. Helen noticed and didn't press. She moved slowly, respecting the invisible boundaries. She didn't touch the locked door. She didn't ask about Camilla. She didn't demand intimate conversations. She built trust brick by brick, the same way she cleaned the house wall by wall. One afternoon she found Martin standing in the parlor, looking around with wide eyes. "It stayed like that for so long," he said softly. "So bad. And I didn't see it because I didn't look. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't." It was the first demonstration of real vulnerability, and Helen felt something warm in her chest. "You're welcome, Martin. We're in this together now." He looked at her with sudden intensity, as if he really saw her for the first time. Then he nodded and left hurriedly. But Helen was left feeling that something had changed. A door was starting to open, even if just a crack, and she, patient as she had always been, would wait the necessary time for it to open completely. 2 weeks after the wedding, Helen woke before dawn to the sound of rain hammering on the roof. It wasn't ordinary rain, it was a violent storm that shook the shingles and made the whole house groan. She got up frightened, lit the lamp, and ran down the hall. She found Martin already up in the parlor, looking up with a worried expression. Leaks had started in 3 different spots. Water dripped from the ceiling, forming puddles on the floor Helen had just waxed 2 days prior. He had already placed buckets and basins underneath, but they weren't enough. "I need to go up and cover the holes with a tarp," said Martin, grabbing a slicker. "Otherwise it will flood the whole house." "It's dangerous," protested Helen. "Wait for daylight." "I can't. By then the water will have ruined the wooden ceiling." He went out to the porch, where a ladder leaned. Helen followed him, holding the lamp high to light the way, while he climbed under the torrential rain. It took almost an hour, Martin working on the slippery roof, while Helen held the ladder at the bottom, soaked to the bone, shouting instructions that could barely be heard over the noise of the storm. When he finally came down, both were shivering with cold. Inside the house, Helen made him take off his wet clothes right there in the kitchen without ceremony. She brought a blanket, brewed hot tea, stoked a high fire in the stove. He obeyed without argument, a sign of how exhausted he was. They sat near the stove, wrapped in blankets, drinking tea from tin mugs that warmed their hands. The rain continued outside, but the leaks had stopped. Helen looked at Martin in the dancing light of the fire. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, beard dripping, eyes tired but relieved. "Thank you for holding the ladder," he said. "I couldn't have done it alone in the dark." "We are married, Martin. That is what marriage is for, isn't it? To hold the ladder for one another." He smiled, small but genuine, the first time she saw him smile for real. It transformed his face completely, took away years of fatigue, revealed the man he had been before the tragedy. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving a clear sky and fresh air. Martin went to check the crops, worried about damage. Helen took the opportunity to attack a new project she had been planning for days. The garden. She took a hoe from the shed and started pulling weeds from the area that had clearly been a vegetable garden once. The work was hard. The sun heated up quickly after the rain. Wet earth weighed on the tool. But Helen persisted, sweat running down, hands forming blisters. She was so concentrated she didn't hear the approach. A female voice behind her made her jump with fright. "So it is true that he finally got one who stayed." Helen turned. A woman stood at the edge of the garden, about 40, sturdy, wearing a simple calico dress, a kerchief tied around her head. She carried a basket on her arm and studied Helen with undisguised curiosity. "I am Jessie," she introduced herself. "I live on the property next door, east border. I saw smoke in the chimney all week and figured there were new folks. Came to meet you." Helen wiped her dirty hand on her apron before extending it for a greeting. "Helen Travers, pleasure to meet you." Jessie shook her hand firmly, then looked around, evaluating. "Doing heavy cleaning, I see. The house needed it. 4 years is too long for a man to live alone in his own grief." "Did you know his first wife?" asked Helen, curiosity overcoming discretion. "I did. Camilla was a sweet girl, maybe too delicate for farm life. She and Martin married young, full of plans." Jessie paused, deciding how much to reveal. "It was a difficult pregnancy from the start. I warned her she should go to the city, stay near a doctor. But Martin wanted his son born here on family land, and Camilla wouldn't contradict her husband in anything." "What happened?" asked Helen softly. "Premature birth. Complicated. The baby didn't survive, born already lifeless. Camilla had a hemorrhage we couldn't stop. The midwife did what she could, but it wasn't enough. We lost both in less than 2 hours." Jessie crossed herself. "Martin was deranged. Buried wife and child in the same coffin, in the town cemetery. Then he sent everyone away and locked himself in here." Helen felt a tightness in her chest, imagining the pain. "That's why he can't touch the house. It's her sanctuary, or was, until you arrived." Jessie studied Helen with growing approval. "You have a determined way about you. You need to handle a man carrying that much weight. Brought some eggs and cheese as a welcome. It's in the basket." "Thank you, Jessie. That is very kind. If you need anything, just send word. A woman alone on a farm needs a support network." The neighbor winked and walked away, leaving Helen with more questions than answers. That night, after dinner, Helen decided to approach the delicate subject. "Martin, can I talk to you about something?" He nodded, taking a cup of coffee. "Jessie came to visit me today." Martin's face closed slightly. "She spoke about Camilla." "She did." Helen chose her words carefully. "I am so sorry for what happened. It must have been terrible." "It was." Martin stared at the cup, voice low. It was the worst thing I ever lived through, losing both at the same time, feeling responsible for not taking her to the city in time. It wasn't your fault, Martin. I feel as if it were. If I had decided differently, maybe nothing would change, interrupted Helen gently. Sometimes things happen and we have no control. Guilt doesn't bring anyone back. It only keeps us trapped. Martin looked at her with eyes shining with contained emotion. I know that in my head. In my heart, it is harder to believe. Helen reached her hand across the table, covering his large, calloused hand. I am here now, Martin. I can't change the past, but I can help you build a different present if you let me. He turned his hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. It was the first truly intimate touch between them. His voice was hoarse when he asked, "Why are you so good to me? I brought you to a destroyed house, a difficult life, didn't even offer a real marriage. Why stay?" Helen thought about the answer. Because you treat me with respect. Because I see a good man under the pain. Because building something from zero is sometimes better than inheriting something ready-made. And because... She squeezed his hand. I also need a fresh start. We are both rebuilding, Martin. Just doing it together. He held her hand for a moment longer, then released it delicately and stood up. I need to rest. It was a long day. But Helen, thank you for everything. She nodded, watching him leave. Slowly, very slowly, the walls were coming down. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming and true love, leave your like and share with someone who needs inspiration today. 2 more weeks passed. April arrived bringing milder temperatures. The house continued transforming. Helen had washed all the curtains, fixed broken furniture with Martin's help, planted the first seedlings in the recovered garden. She bought chickens in town and restocked the repaired coop. The property was beginning to look alive again. The relationship between them was also changing. Small intimacies arose naturally. Martin began telling stories about his childhood, about his parents, about how he learned farming. Helen spoke about her years as a teacher, the students she loved, the books that formed her. They cooked together now. He taught recipes his mother made. She adapted them with her own touches. They ate, discussing plans for the farm, necessary repairs, the future in practical terms that hid a growing hope. One night Helen was reading by the light of the lamp in the parlour when Martin returned late from town. He carried a parcel under his arm. He stopped at the entrance of the room, looking a bit awkward. "I bought something for you," he said. "It isn't much, but I saw it and thought..." He extended the parcel. Helen opened it curiously and found 3 books, a romance, a book of poetry, and a treatise on gardening. They were used books, but well preserved. She felt tears burn in her eyes. "Martin, you didn't have to. I know you like to read. I saw you reading the same old magazine 3 times. Thought you might like new books." He scratched his neck, embarrassed. "The bookseller said these are good." Helen stood up and, without thinking, hugged him. It was an impulsive hug, full of genuine gratitude. Martin went rigid for a second, then relaxed and returned it with delicacy, strong arms wrapping around her carefully, as if she were fragile. "Thank you," whispered Helen against his chest. "It is the most thoughtful gift I have ever received." They stayed like that for a moment that stretched, comfortable and warm. When they separated, there was something different in the air between them, a mutual acknowledgement that this was becoming more than convenience. But the locked door remained closed, a constant reminder of what Martin still couldn't face. In May, a letter arrived from town. It was from the courthouse, informing them about land registration documentation that needed updating. Martin would have to go to town to resolve it, a process that would take all day. "Do you want to come along?" he offered during breakfast. Helen thought about going, then decided against it. "I prefer to stay and continue the work in the garden. But can you bring more seeds if you find them? Tomato and bell pepper." Martin nodded, finished his coffee, and left early. Helen watched him disappear down the road in the buggy, then went back inside. She worked in the garden all morning, planting, watering, pulling invasive weeds. At noon she went inside to prepare lunch. That was when she heard it. A sound coming from inside the house. A child's cry, faint but unmistakable. Helen stopped, heart accelerating. The house was empty except for her. Where was that coming from? She followed the sound, walking slowly down the hallway. It got louder as she approached the locked door. She stopped in front of it, hand on the knob. The crying continued, soft, melancholic, definitely coming from inside that room. Goosebumps rose on her arms. She turned the knob, locked, as always. But curiosity was now agony. What was in there? Why did there seem to be a baby crying, coming from a room Martin hadn't opened in 4 years? Helen made a decision. She looked for spare keys she had seen in the kitchen cupboard. There were several on an old ring. She took them all, returned to the door, and began trying them one by one. On the 5th attempt, the key turned. The lock opened with a soft click. Helen paused, hand on the knob, heart beating out of rhythm. Should she? It was an invasion of Martin's privacy. But the sound... She opened the door slowly. The smell that came out was of a place closed for a long time, mold and dried flowers. The afternoon light entered through a window with a partially open curtain, illuminating a room frozen in time. It was a nursery, a carved wooden crib in the center, covered with a delicate hand-embroidered blanket. Small dresser with a changing pad on top. Rocking chair near the window, shelves with cloth toys, children's books, a music box. On the walls, naive paintings of animals and flowers, everything covered by a thin layer of dust but preserved like a museum. On the dresser, a tiny white baptismal gown, carefully folded. Beside it, a pair of baby shoes that were never used, and a photo in a delicate frame. A younger Martin, smiling beside a small, graceful woman with light hair and a gentle face. Camilla. Her belly was large under a floral dress, hands resting protectively over it. Helen entered slowly, holding her breath. The crying had stopped. She realized then it came from the music box on the shelf, an automatic winding mechanism that hadn't completely wound down, emitting distorted sounds that sounded like weeping. She approached the crib. The blanket had flowers embroidered one by one with infinite care, an embroidery of maternal love, preparing a nest for a child who never got to use it. Helen touched the blanket with fingers trembling slightly. This room represented all the destroyed dreams. Every object was an unfulfilled promise, a crib that stayed empty, clothes that dressed no one, toys that brought no joy. It was the saddest thing Helen had ever seen. She understood then completely why Martin couldn't open that door. It wasn't just about Camilla. It was about an entire future that died along with her and the baby. It was about stolen fatherhood, about the family that should have been. Opening that door was facing everything he lost all at once. Helen sat in the rocking chair, crushed by the weight of another's tragedy. She stayed there for a long time, looking around, feeling the pain that impregnated that space like dampness in the walls. When she finally stood up, it was already mid-afternoon. She closed the door carefully, locked it again, returned the key to its place. She didn't know if she would tell Martin she had entered. It felt like betrayal, but at the same time she needed to know to fully understand the man she had married. Martin returned at dusk, tired but satisfied. Paperwork resolved, seeds bought, some new tools. They ate dinner talking about daily matters. He didn't notice anything different about her, or if he did, he didn't comment. But when they were going to retire, Helen stopped him in the hallway. "Martin, I need to talk to you." He looked at her, realizing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" Helen took a deep breath. "This morning I heard a sound coming from that locked room. The music box, I think. I couldn't ignore it. I opened the door. I'm sorry for intruding, but I needed to understand. Martin's face lost all colour. He stood absolutely still, eyes fixed on her with a mixture of shock and something close to betrayal. You went in there? I did. I saw the baby's room. I saw the things you two prepared. I saw the photo of you two. Helen took a step toward him. Martin, I understand now. I understand why it is so difficult to move on, but you need to understand something too. He stepped back, jaw tense. You had no right. I know, it was wrong, but I'm going to say it anyway. That room is killing you slowly. Keeping everything exactly as it was doesn't bring anyone back. It only keeps you trapped in a day that never ends. You don't understand anything, said Martin, with a voice hoarse with emotion. You don't know what it is to lose like that. You're right, I don't know, but I know what it is to live with a ghost of the past destroying the present, and I know that if you don't face that, you will never be able to truly live again. Martin shook his head, retreating further. I'm not ready. When will you be? A year from now? 5? 10? Helen continued, voice gentle but firm. Life is passing, Martin. You are 34 years old. You can still have a future, have a family, have joy, but not while you are living as the caretaker of a private cemetery. Stop, he asked, almost pleading. Please, stop. Helen stopped. She took a deep breath, controlling her own emotion. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pressed. It was my mistake to enter there. Martin stood in the hallway for a long moment, visibly struggling with emotions. Then he turned and went to his room, closing the door behind him with a firmness that was almost a slam. Helen was left alone in the dark hallway, heart tight. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe she had destroyed the fragile trust they had built. She returned to her own room, lay down, and cried silently into her pillow. For the next 3 days, Martin barely spoke to her. He was polite, correct, but distant. He left before dawn, returned late, ate in silence. Helen respected his space, continued working on the house and garden, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. On the 4th night, she was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Martin came in earlier than usual. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her for a long moment. Helen, he called. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Yes? I need to show you something. He guided her down the hallway until stopping in front of the locked door. He took the key from his pocket, hand trembling visibly. Helen remained silent, barely daring to breathe. Martin opened the door. He entered slowly, like someone entering a minefield. Helen followed him, staying close but not touching. He walked to the crib, fingers running lightly over the wooden rail. I made this with my own hands, he said with a choked voice. Took me 2 months. Every carving, every finish. Wanted it to be perfect for our son. It turned out beautiful, said Helen softly. Martin picked up the baptismal gown. Camilla embroidered the flowers. She wasn't very skilled with a needle, pricked herself all the time, but she insisted on doing every stitch herself. Said her son was going to be baptized in a dress made by her own hands. He pressed the fabric against his chest, and then he broke. Sobs came out deep. Years of dammed-up pain finally finding escape. Helen went to him, wrapped him in her arms, and held him while he cried like he hadn't cried since the day he buried his wife and child. They sat on the floor of the room, Martin with his head on her shoulder, while he finally let the pain out. He spoke about Camilla between sobs, about how they met, how happy they were, how they waited anxiously for the baby. He spoke about the horrible birth, the blood that wouldn't stop, the screams, the terrible silence when he realized he had lost them both. He spoke about the guilt he carried, the feeling of having failed to protect those he loved most. Helen listened to everything, stroking his hair, whispering comfort. When he finally fell silent, exhausted, she spoke softly. Martin, you didn't fail. You loved the best way you knew how. Sometimes, love isn't enough to change destiny. And there is no shame in that. But what if I forget? He asked with the voice of a frightened child. What if I let go and forget her? You will never forget. Camilla will always be with you, part of who you are. But remembering doesn't mean stopping living. Honoring her doesn't mean burying yourself along with her. She would want you to be happy again. Martin looked at her with red eyes. You think? I'm certain. A woman who embroiders flowers on a baptism gown, even without skill with a needle, is a woman who believes in love and hope. She would want you to find love again. Maybe not the same, but real nonetheless. He held Helen's hand. I don't know how to do that. Little by little, replied Helen, one day at a time, starting perhaps by letting this room breathe a little. Open the window, dust it off, not destroy, but also not keep as a tomb. Martin nodded slowly. They sat there until it grew completely dark, then stood up together. Martin left the door open when they exited, a symbolic but significant first step. In the following weeks, something fundamental changed between them. The shared vulnerability created an intimacy that hadn't existed before. Martin began to speak more openly, to smile more frequently, to touch Helen with casual affection, a hand on her back, fingers brushing when passing plates. Together, they cleaned the baby's room. They donated clothes and toys to a needy family in town, keeping only a few pieces of sentimental value. They transformed the space into a sewing room for Helen, keeping the rocking chair and a photo of Camilla on the wall, a homage without idolatry. Helen discovered that Martin had a dry sense of humor that appeared when relaxed. He discovered that she sang softly while she cooked, songs she had learned from her aunt and uncle. They began eating breakfast together on the porch, watching the sunrise, talking about plans and dreams. One night in June, after dinner, they were sitting near the stove when Martin took her hand. Helen, he said, looking into her eyes, I need to tell you something. You can tell me. When you arrived here, I was dead inside. I had no future, only past. You brought life back, not just to the house, but to me. He paused, searching for words. I don't know when it happened exactly, but at some moment in the last few months, this ceased to be a marriage of convenience. For me, at least, I fell in love with you, Helen, for real. Helen felt tears fill her eyes. For the love of God, Martin. I was already waiting for you to realize that for weeks. I fell in love with you too. With this good and strong man who was hidden under all the pain. He pulled her into a tight hug. Can I kiss you? He asked against her hair. Please kiss, replied Helen, laughing through tears. The kiss was soft, careful, full of promise. When they separated, both were smiling. The first night of a true beginning, not as strangers fulfilling a contract, but as a couple choosing each other consciously. And the house around them, with clean walls and open windows, seemed to witness in silent approval, finally returning to being a true home. September arrived, bringing spring to rural Georgia, and with it a complete transformation that no one who knew St. Helens Farm 6 months prior would recognize now. The big house stood under a blue sky with a renewed appearance, walls whitewashed pure white, the roof repaired without a shingle out of place, clean windows reflecting sunlight, the front garden exploding in colors of flowers that Helen had planted with obsessive dedication. The orchard in the back was pruned and productive, ripe fruit hanging from the branches. The chicken coop bustled with life, hens scratching and brooding eggs. The vegetable garden was Helen's particular pride, organized rows of green vegetables, red tomatoes, shiny bell peppers. The wash tank, fixed and gleaming, saw constant use. Even the abandoned tenant shacks were being rebuilt little by little, Martin having hired 2 caretakers with families to live on the property and help with the growing work. But the most profound transformation wasn't visible to external eyes. It was in the relationship between Martin and Helen, which flourished like a well-tended garden, growing stronger and more rooted with each passing day. Martin woke before dawn, but now he didn't leave the bed immediately. He stayed a few minutes observing Helen sleep beside him, brown hair spread on the pillow, face serene, breath soft. He marveled silently at how that woman had arrived as a desperate stranger and become the absolute center of his life, the reason he woke with the will to face the day. Helen, for her part, discovered happiness she never imagined possible. The work was hard. Her hands were calloused. Her body ached at the end of the day. But it was a good ache, the result of effort that built something real. And Martin, her contract husband who had become a husband of the heart, treated her with a mixture of reverence and passion that made her feel precious for the first time in her life. They had an established routine now. They woke together, prepared breakfast side by side in the kitchen, talking about the day's plans. Martin went to supervise the workers in the fields, but always returned for lunch, an absolute refusal to spend the whole day away as he did before. They ate on the porch when the weather allowed, watching the property stretch out before them. Afternoons he spent in the field. She took care of the house and garden. Nights were theirs, quiet dinners followed by conversations in the parlor or on the porch, sometimes shared reading, Helen reading aloud from the books Martin continued buying for her whenever he went to town. And the physical intimacy, which had started shy and hesitant, had blossomed into something beautiful and natural, a physical expression of the love growing between them. Jessie, the neighbor, visited Helen weekly now, always bringing something, eggs, cheese, sweets, pretexts for long conversations both appreciated. It was during one of these visits, on a warm September afternoon, that Jessie looked at Helen with experienced eyes and asked a direct question. "You're pregnant, aren't you?" Helen, who was serving coffee, almost dropped the cup. "How do you know? I myself only suspected last week." Jessie laughed. "A woman who has had 5 children recognizes the signs. You have that glow. And I noticed you didn't drink strong coffee today, asked for tea. Morning sickness?" Helen sat down, hands trembling slightly. "It's starting. Some mornings are difficult. Jessie, I am terrified." "Why, child? It is a blessing. What if the same thing happens that happened to Camilla? What if I lose the baby? What if Martin loses me? I don't know if he could survive that again." Jessie held her hands firmly. "Listen here, Helen. Every pregnancy is unique. What happened to Camilla was a tragedy, but it doesn't mean it will repeat. You are strong, healthy, older, and more prepared. And this time, we will do it differently. No waiting until the last minute. When it's close to the time, you go to town. Stay at my sister's house, who lives near the doctor. The birth will be attended properly. Do you think Martin will agree?" "If he doesn't agree, I'll knock some sense into him myself." Jessie squeezed Helen's hands. "But you need to tell him soon. A man has the right to know he's going to be a father." Helen nodded, throat tight with emotion. "I'll tell him tonight." Jessie left shortly after, leaving Helen with a whirlwind of thoughts. She had been sure of the pregnancy for a week, a missed period combined with morning sickness and breast tenderness. Part of her was radiant with joy. Another part, terrified of all the things that could go wrong. She prepared a special dinner that night, roast chicken with potatoes, custard pudding for dessert. Martin noticed the effort when he arrived. "Special occasion?" he asked, kissing her on the forehead. "Could be," replied Helen mysteriously. They ate, talking about trivialities. Helen waited until they finished dessert, until Martin was relaxed and satisfied. Then she took a deep breath and spoke. "Martin, I need to tell you something important." He looked at her, realizing the seriousness in her tone. "Go ahead." "I am pregnant. I think 2 months along." Martin's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, joy, and then fear. "Are you sure?" "I am." All the signs are present. He stood absolutely still for a moment that seemed eternal. Then he stood up abruptly, turning his back to her, hands resting on the edge of the table. Helen saw his shoulders shaking. "Martin," she called softly, getting up and touching his back. "Talk to me." When he turned, tears were running down his face. "I'm scared, Helen, so scared. I don't know if I can go through that again." "It won't be like the last time," she promised, holding his face between her hands. "We are going to do it differently. I will have proper medical monitoring. When it is close to the time, I will go to town to be near a hospital. Jessie already offered help. We will do everything right. And if even so," he couldn't finish the sentence, "then we face it together. But Martin, look at me." Helen forced him to look at her. "We cannot live in fear of tragedies that may never happen. We have to trust that this time will be different, that our child will be born healthy and grow strong on this land you love so much." "Our child?" repeated Martin, voice choked. The reality hitting. "We are going to have a child." We are," confirmed Helen, smiling through her own tears. He pulled her into a desperate hug, face buried in her hair. "Sorry for not reacting better. I am happy. I swear I am. I am just terrified too." "I know, I am too. But we will be fine. The three of us will be fine." They stayed like that for a long time, hugged in the kitchen, two scared but hopeful adults, holding each other against the uncertainties of the future. In the following days, Martin became excessively protective. He didn't want Helen to do heavy work, carry weight, stay too long in the sun. She had to remind him constantly that pregnancy wasn't a disease, that she needed to remain active and useful. But Helen also took precautions. She decreased her work pace, rested more, ate better. Jessie visited more frequently, bringing teas and advice from an experienced woman. She taught Helen about proper nutrition, light exercises, warning signs to watch for. In October, Martin insisted on taking her to town to see the doctor. Dr. Abernathy, a 60-year-old man with a modest but clean office, examined Helen carefully, pronounced that she was healthy, baby developing well, expected delivery for March of the following year. "But I strongly recommend," he said, looking at Martin seriously, "that the lady comes to town in the last month, to be near proper assistance in case of complications. An isolated farm is no place for a first-time birth at 32 years of age." Martin nodded vigorously. "She will come. I will rent a house in town if necessary." Helen wanted to protest, say it was an exaggeration, but saw the determination on Martin's face and decided not to argue. It was already costing him to accept the pregnancy without constant panic. She could make this concession. The news spread through the neighborhood. Jessie, incapable of keeping a secret, told other farm wives in the region. Soon Helen received visits from curious women wanting to meet Martin's wife, who had achieved the miracle of bringing him back to life. They brought gifts, baby clothes, unsolicited advice, stories of their own births that sometimes helped and sometimes terrified. Mrs. Euler, a 70-year-old lady who lived 3 properties over, appeared one afternoon bringing a delicate crochet blanket. "Made for my grandson, but he grew up and doesn't use it anymore. I want your baby to have it." The old woman held Helen's hands with knobby fingers. "You worked a miracle, girl. Martin was lost, we all knew. You found him." "I think we found each other," corrected Helen gently. "Maybe, but it was you who had the courage to stay when everyone fled. It was you who had the patience to wait for him to heal. That is true love, the kind that builds, not the kind that only appears when it's easy." The words stayed with Helen, warming her chest. She had made the right choice after all. The desperate choice at the beginning had turned out to be the best decision of her life. November brought intense heat and Helen's belly beginning to grow visibly. Martin developed a habit of talking to her belly every night, large hand resting on the gentle curve, telling about the farm, about the plans he had for the future, about how he could hardly wait to teach his son or daughter to walk those lands. Helen lay listening, heart overflowing with love for that man who had been broken and was reassembling himself piece by piece. One afternoon, she was in the garden picking tomatoes when she felt sudden dizziness. The world spun, legs grew weak. She managed to sit down before falling completely. The sky above was very bright, sun too hot. Black spots danced in her vision. Mrs. Rose, one of the new caretakers, saw her and ran over. "Miss Helen, are you all right?" "Just dizziness," murmured Helen. "Must be the heat." Mrs. Rose helped her into the house, made her lie on the parlor sofa, brought cool water and a wet cloth for her forehead. When Martin returned an hour later and found Helen lying pale, he panicked. "What happened? Are they calling the doctor?" "Martin, calm down. It was just heat dizziness. It passed. You shouldn't be working in the garden in the strong sun." He was clearly terrified, bad memories returning. "What if it was something serious?" "It isn't. Baby is fine. I am fine." Helen held his hand. "But maybe it is time for me to slow down more." From that day on, Martin practically forbade her from heavy work. He hired a girl from the village to help Helen with domestic tasks. Lenora, 16 years old, shy but helpful, arrived every morning and helped with cleaning, cooking, laundry. Helen protested initially, but secretly she was relieved. The pregnancy was tiring her more than she admitted. December arrived, bringing Christmas festivities. Martin and Helen went to town for Christmas Mass, the first time they appeared publicly as a couple since the hasty civil wedding months before. They caused a sensation. The women surrounded Helen, wanting to touch her already prominent belly. The men greeted Martin with slaps on the back, congratulating him on impending fatherhood. Father Anselm, who had celebrated the wedding, called them after Mass. "I am very happy for you too. I feared Martin would never recover. But God places the right people in our lives at the right moment." Helen and Martin returned to the farm at night, buggy lit by a lantern, starry sky above. Helen rested her head on his shoulder, hand over her belly where the baby kicked lightly. "Happy?" asked Martin. "More than I imagined possible," she replied sincerely. January of 1913 brought heavy rains that were at once a blessing for crops and a curse for roads. The house, now completely renovated, resisted the storms well. There were no more leaks, no more dampness. It was a solid fortress protecting the growing family. Helen was 6 months pregnant, belly large, movements slower. Martin had transformed the old sewing room, which had been Camilla's baby's room, into a new nursery. This time, however, it wasn't a sanctuary of expectations. It was a practical and cheerful space, painted soft yellow, with a new crib Martin built with a different pattern than the previous one, light curtains, simple shelves. If you are following this story and want to see the emotional ending, don't leave here. Helen embroidered diapers and clothes in the afternoons, sitting in the rocking chair that had been Camilla's. There was no jealousy of the dead there. There was continuity, honor to the past without being a prisoner of it. February came hot and humid. Helen was huge now, moving with difficulty, sleeping poorly because of the discomfort. Martin was attentive to every groan, every change of expression. It was clear he was counting days with growing anxiety. In early March, as agreed, Martin took Helen to town. He had rented a small house near Dr. Abernathy's office. It was a simple place, 2 bedrooms, kitchen, parlor. Martin refused to return to the farm, staying with Helen, sleeping poorly in a narrow bed, checking on her constantly. Jessie came to stay too, bringing experience and calm. Dr. Abernathy visited Helen daily, monitoring progress, said everything was fine, baby in correct position, Helen healthy despite advanced age for a first pregnancy. Contractions started in the early hours of mid-March, 2 weeks before the predicted date. Helen woke with back pain, then rhythmic cramps. She shook Martin awake. "I think it's started." He jumped out of bed as if shocked. Martin ran to fetch Dr. Abernathy while Jessie stayed with Helen, timing contractions, preparing hot water and clean sheets as tradition dictated. The labor lasted 14 hours. It wasn't easy. Helen working hard with every contraction, sweat soaking the sheets, pain that seemed endless. But Dr. Abernathy was present, monitoring everything, ensuring there were no complications. Jessie held one of Helen's hands, gave words of encouragement. Martin held the other hand, face pale but present, refusing to leave despite Dr. Abernathy suggesting it might be better. When finally the baby was born at dusk, the strong and indignant cry filled the room like music more beautiful than anyone had ever heard. "It's a boy," announced Dr. Abernathy, lifting the red and perfect child, healthy and screaming like a bull. "Good sign." Martin collapsed beside the bed, sobbing with relief and joy. Helen, exhausted but radiant, extended her arms to receive her son. The baby was placed on her chest, still connected to her by a cord that would soon be cut. She looked at that crumpled little face, eyes closed, mouth open in a cry, and felt love so intense it hurt. Martin touched his son's little head with trembling fingers. "Is he okay? Is he really okay?" "Perfect," guaranteed Dr. Abernathy. 10 fingers on hands, 10 on feet, strong lungs, heart beating steady. "You have a healthy son, Mr. Travers." Martin kissed Helen's forehead, then kissed the baby's head. "Thank you," he whispered, not knowing if he thanked Helen, God, or the destiny that gave him a second chance. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for being mine." Helen couldn't stop crying, tears of exhaustion and happiness running down. "We love you," she said to Martin. "So much." They baptized the boy 2 weeks later, a small but emotional ceremony at the town church. The chosen name was Gabriel Travers, angel messenger, he who brings good tidings. Godmother and godfather were Jessie and her husband, Joseph. The baby cried during the entire baptism, a scandal that made everyone laugh. They returned to the farm in April, a complete family now. The house received them as if it were waiting, windows open letting the breeze enter, flowers in the garden swaying colourful, chickens scratching in the yard. Helen entered carrying Gabriel wrapped in a blanket, Martin beside her carrying bundles of clothes. They stopped in the parlour looking around, the same room Helen had seen for the first time 8 months before, covered in dust and despair. Now it was full of light and life and promise. "Welcome home, my son," whispered Martin to the baby who slept oblivious to the meaning of the moment. The following months were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, dirty diapers, constant nursing, exhaustion neither of them was prepared to face. But they were also months of indescribable joy. The first time Gabriel smiled for real, the first time he recognized Martin and reached out his little hands to him. First sunbath in the yard, baby kicking his legs in a basin of warm water. Martin revealed himself a dedicated and passionate father. He woke in the middle of the night to take Gabriel when he cried, letting Helen rest. He sang folk songs his mother sang, voice deep and off-key but full of love. He took his son to see the farm, explaining about the plants, the animals, the land, as if a months-old baby could understand. Helen observed husband and son together and felt overflowing gratitude. She had come to that house as a desperate refugee, accepting marriage to a stranger. She had stayed when everyone fled, not out of heroism, but lack of alternative. She had worked hard transforming an abandoned house into a home, not out of holiness, but practical necessity. But somewhere along the line, without realizing exactly when, necessity had become choice. Stranger had become friend, friend had become beloved, house had become home. And she, a woman without family and without future, had become wife, mother, pillar of a new family built together on the ruins of the past. September arrived again, completing a year since Helen arrived. Martin insisted on celebrating. He hired Jessie to stay with Gabriel for an afternoon and took Helen for a picnic in a beautiful area of the farm, a clearing near a creek where the shade of large trees provided coolness. He spread a blanket on the ground, opened a basket with food he had prepared secretly, even brought wine he was saving for a special occasion. Helen laughed at his formality, at the clumsy way he tried to be romantic. "What is all this, Martin Travers?" "Celebration. It's been a year since you arrived and stayed. A year since my life started making sense again." He poured wine into glasses, handed one to her. "I wanted to thank you formally for everything you did, everything you are." Helen touched her glass to his. "I didn't do anything extraordinary, I just stayed." "You stayed," he repeated, looking into her eyes with intensity. "When 5 others fled, you stayed. When you saw a destroyed house, you stayed. When you discovered a broken man, you stayed. When it would have been easier to give up 1,000 times, you continued staying. Is that not extraordinary?" Helen thought about the question. "Maybe it is. Or maybe we just find strength we didn't know we had when there is no other option. I stayed because I had nowhere to go, but I stay now because there is no other place in the world I would rather be." Martin pulled her for a long, deep kiss, full of gratitude and promise and love, built on a solid base of daily choices. When they separated, he had a question in his eyes. "Are you happy, Helen? For real? Happier than I ever dreamed of being? Are you happy?" "I am complete. For the first time in years, I am whole again. It isn't the same as it was before. It is different, but it is real and it is good and it is ours." They spent the afternoon talking about future plans. Martin wanted to expand the farm, buy adjacent lands, build a small school for the region's children, including Gabriel when he grew up. Helen wanted more children, siblings for Gabriel. She also wanted to return to teaching in some way, maybe giving private lessons to the workers' children. They daydreamed about a future that finally seemed possible, sitting side by side on that land that had seen so much pain, but now witnessed renewal. 2 years later, Helen was pregnant again. A girl this time, born without complications in a peaceful birth in the same little house in town. They named her Olivia, olive flower, symbol of peace. Gabriel, 2.5 years old, was initially jealous but soon fell in love with his little sister, wanting to help with everything. The house grew in life and noise, baby cries, children's laughter, conversations of a passionate couple. The farm prospered. Martin had hired more workers, expanded crops, started raising cattle. The school he dreamed of was built, a simple but functional construction where a teacher from town taught 20 children from the region. Helen, though busy with small children, found time to give occasional literacy classes to adult workers who never had the opportunity to learn. She performed work she loved, contributing to the community that had welcomed her. Jessie, now a close friend and godmother to both children, visited weekly. They sat on the porch while children played in the yard, talking about life, challenges of motherhood, rumors of the region. On one of those afternoons, Jessie commented thoughtfully, "You know your story became a legend around here, don't you?" "What do you mean?" asked Helen, surprised. "The woman who stayed when everyone fled. The woman who brought Martin Travers back from the dead. The woman who transformed a cursed house into a blessed home. Mothers tell their daughters as an example of courage and perseverance." Helen didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I am not a storybook heroine, Jessie. I am just a woman who did what needed doing." Maybe that is what makes the story beautiful. It isn't about impossible heroism. It is about an ordinary person choosing to stay and work and love when it would have been easier to run. That anyone can do if they have courage. Helen looked at Martin playing with Gabriel and Olivia in the garden, the three of them dirty with earth and happy. She looked at the house they restored together, now truly beautiful. She looked at the life they built on ruins, brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice. Maybe Jessie was right. Maybe the story was extraordinary precisely for having started so ordinary. Marriage of convenience, cold contract, raw necessity. But through work, patience, and the daily choice to remain, even when it was difficult, something beautiful had blossomed. 5 women fled before her, horrified at the house in ruins. Helen stayed, not because she was stronger or better, but because she had no other option. And in the lack of options, she found the freedom to build something genuinely hers. The house wasn't cursed, after all. It was just waiting. Waiting for hands willing to work, waiting for a heart willing to be patient, waiting for love willing to grow slowly, rooting deeply before blooming. And Helen, unjustly fired teacher, woman without family and without future, had become exactly what that house and that man needed. Not by magic or grand destiny, but by the silent persistence of continuing to show up day after day, doing the work that was in front of her, loving the man who was beside her, building the life that was possible with the materials she had. Years later, when Gabriel was 10 and Olivia 8, along with Camilla, the 3rd daughter named in honor of Martin's first wife, in a joint decision that symbolized complete peace with the past, the family was sitting on the porch on a Sunday afternoon. Gabriel asked how his parents met. Martin and Helen exchanged looks, smiling with the complicity of those who share a long history. "Your father asked for a wife by letter," began Helen, "because he was very lonely and needed company." "And many women came before, Mommy," continued Martin, "but all fled when they saw how ugly and abandoned our house was." "Why didn't Mommy run?" wanted to know Olivia. Helen pulled her daughter into her lap, kissing the top of her little head. "Because I had nowhere to go, and because I looked at the house and saw not what it was, but what it could become. I looked at your father and saw not a broken man, but a man who just needed time and help to heal." "Ah, and you stayed," said Gabriel, who had heard versions of the story but never tired of it. "And I stayed," confirmed Helen, looking at Martin, "and it was the best decision I ever made." Martin held her hand, a simple gesture but loaded with years of consciously built love. "Marriage isn't about finding the perfect person," he said to his children. "It is about finding the right person and building something beautiful together, even when it is difficult. Especially when it is difficult." The sun was setting over St. Helens farm, dyeing the sky orange and pink. The house looked beautiful under the golden light, flower garden blooming, structure solid and well kept. Chickens were retiring to the coop. The smell of dinner came from the kitchen, where Lenora, now married and a mother too, but still working for the family, prepared food. And Helen, sitting on that porch, surrounded by a family she never imagined having, in a house she helped resurrect, beside a man she learned to love deeply, felt overflowing gratitude for all the doors that closed, forcing her to accept this one. Because sometimes the best stories begin not with glorious choices, but with a lack of options that forces us to discover strengths we didn't know we had. Sometimes home isn't a place we find ready. It is a place we build with dirty hands and aching backs and a heart willing to try one more day. And sometimes true love isn't instant passion that sweeps off feet. It is the daily decision to stay, to work, to choose that person again when waking up each morning. It is the slow and deliberate construction of a shared life, brick over brick, year over year, until looking around and realizing one built something so beautiful and solid that one cannot imagine having lived any other way. 5 women fled upon seeing Martin Travers' house. Helen Foster stayed. And in that staying, she found not only a house and husband, but herself, a version of herself she would never know existed if she hadn't been forced by difficult circumstances to discover she was stronger, more patient, more capable than she ever imagined. The house that scared away 5 brides became the home of a happy family. The man no one could reach became a loving husband and dedicated father. The desperate woman without a future became the matriarch of a legacy that would last generations. And all because, on a day in March of 1912, a tired woman looked at a house in ruins and a wounded man, and instead of running like all before her, simply stayed.